the modern welfare state and, the breakdown of the traditional family aren't just the results of progressive evolution, but rather a deliberate 800-year colonial strategy that's just been updated for the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive question.
Right. I really want you to think about that for a second. What if everything you've been told about the changing dynamics of the home is actually masking the systemic, calculated displacement of the biological father?
It's a premise that completely upends the conventional narrative, of social progress. Because we are so accustomed to viewing these shifts in family structure, the rise of single-parent households, the expansion of the state as just natural, inevitable consequences of modernity.
Right, like it was just bound to happen.
Exactly. But the material we are looking at today argues that this trajectory is anything but natural. It basically frames it as a highly engineered socio-political outcome.
And before we plunge into this massive topic, just a quick piece of housekeeping. Please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive.
Yes, definitely do that.
Today, we're undertaking a really monumental mission. We are looking at a stack of incredibly provocative material. It's this ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating new ebook titled Colonized by Cowards: How the State Replaced the Irish Father and Destroyed the Home.
Written by Conrad Reicher.
Right, Conrad Reicher. And for men seeking to understand the history of Western institutions before they were, as the author alleges, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, this is framed as absolutely essential reading.
It really is.
This text is targeted directly at a red-pilled manosphere audience. And I mean, it is an unapologetic, deeply aggressive deconstruction of modern gender dynamics.
It's very aggressive, yeah.
And listen, if this deep dive piques your interest as we go, you need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy the book. And also definitely follow the author at Conrad Reicher on Substack.
And that actually brings us to an incredibly important disclaimer before we unpack a single page of this.
Right, we need to clarify this up front.
Because this text contains highly charged political and social commentary aimed at a very specific demographic, we need to be crystal clear about the framework of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We, as your hosts, are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints within this book, nor are we condemning them. Our mission today is strictly to impartially unpack and analyze the author's exact arguments, the mechanics of his logic, and his historical claims.
Exactly. We're just the guides here.
Right. We are just here to convey the ideas contained in the original source material so that you can understand the exact architecture of his worldview and, well, evaluate it for yourself.
The text is the territory. So let's just unpack this. Reicher doesn't actually start his argument in the modern family court or with contemporary welfare policy, right? He goes way, way back.
Oh, yeah. Centuries back.
He posits that the current state of Western masculinity is the result of an 800-year campaign of subjugation, and he uses Ireland as the ultimate historical case study.
Yeah, he introduces this foundational concept he calls the humiliation architecture.
The humiliation architecture.
Right, and to understand this, we really have to look at how he traces the lineage of this architecture directly to British imperial policy in Ireland.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, the core of his argument is that to permanently control a population, you can't just defeat them militarily on a battlefield, right? Like, military victories are temporary.
Because they can always just regroup and rebel again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To secure lasting compliance, he says you have to break the psychology of the native male. You have to literally strip him of his agency and his role as a provider.
And he zeroes in heavily on the penal laws for this, right? Specifically, this piece of legislation known as the Popery Act of 1704.
Yes, the 1704 Act is a huge focal point for him.
I really want to focus on the mechanics of that 1704 Act because it's fascinating. The law explicitly forbade Irish Catholic men from holding public office, sure, but it went much deeper into their personal economies.
Right, it restricted how they could inherit property, forcing them to fracture estates among all their sons, rather than allowing wealth to concentrate in a single heir.
Which destroys generational wealth building. But the detail Reicher really hyper-focuses on is this provision forbidding an Irish Catholic man from owning a horse valued at more than 5 pounds.
Yeah, the 5-pound horse rule.
Which, to a modern ear, I mean, a 5-pound horse sounds like a weird, obscure tax regulation, like, who cares?
It does sound completely obscure until you break down what a horse represented in an 18th century agrarian society.
Right.
Reicher argues that a society that forbids a man from owning a horse of value doesn't just hate his religion, it actively fears his mobility, and his economic potential.
The mechanism there is crucial. I mean, a valuable horse was the primary engine of wealth generation back then.
Exactly. It allowed a man to plow more land, transport goods to further markets, breed better stock. It was essentially his business capital.
So if a man cannot hold valuable property, he can't build equity. And if he can't build wealth, he can't secure a mate.
He can't provide for his lineage, and he can't project power into the future. It is, in Riker's words, a forced biological and psychological reduction.
You essentially turn the independent patriarch into a dependent serf on his own land. And Riker writes that the state intentionally destroys the patriarchal clan structure to create what he calls a gynocentric entry point.
Yeah, that gynocentric entry point is key to his whole thesis.
Let's explore what he means by the clan structure before it was dismantled, because Riker looks at pre-colonization Ireland and points to the Brehon law system.
Right, the ancient texts outlining how society was structured around the clan head, the Fleth.
Under that ancient system, the Flaith had absolute economic and legal authority over his kin.
He did. He owned the land collectively for the clan, he settled disputes, and critically, he defended the family from outside threats.
And Riker calls this ancient patriarchal structure a firewall.
A firewall, yeah. Meaning, as long as that firewall existed, the centralized state could not penetrate the home.
Because if the male head of household is handling the protection and the provision, the state literally has no job there.
Exactly. The state has no leverage to extract taxes or enforce behavioral compliance if the local patriarch is handling all the governance.
And the British Empire, according to the text, understood this dynamic perfectly.
They did. Riker argues they realized they could never fully conquer Ireland as long as the Irish male possessed an economic backbone and a cultural mandate to protect his kin.
So, the destruction of that male authority through the land confiscations of the plantations, the flight of the earls in 1607, and eventually these penal laws, it was all entirely strategic.
Right. It creates that gynocentric entry point.
Because when the local patriarch is dispossessed or culturally neutered, this massive vacuum opens up.
And the centralized tyrant, the state, seamlessly steps into that vacuum as the surrogate provider and protector.
The author is basically arguing that the state becomes the new husband.
Yeah, that's exactly his framing, and he takes this to its most extreme historical conclusion when he examines the Great Famine in the 1840s.
This part was intense, because we usually learned about the potato blight as a devastating natural disaster, right? Like an agricultural failure that led to mass starvation.
But Riker frames this entirely differently. He calls it an engineered apocalypse, designed to finalize the castration of the indigenous male.
Engineered apocalypse? I mean, he is incredibly pointed about the logistics of the famine.
He is. He notes that while the potato crop failed, Ireland was still producing massive amounts of grain, beef, and dairy.
But those food exports were being shipped out of Ireland to England under armed British guard.
That is the crucial mechanism for Riker's argument. He frames the tragedy of 1847, the coffin ships, the million dead, not as an act of God, but as the ultimate manifestation of state power.
Reducing proud, independent men to biological ash.
Right. He argues that when a man cannot provide for his starving family because an occupying force literally steals his harvest at the point of a bayonet, that man is being subjected to a state-enforced eradication of his masculine essence.
His biological mandate is to provide, and the state uses lethal force to ensure he fails.
Exactly.
And here is where Riker makes a massive, highly aggressive leap. He draws a direct line between those 17th and 19th century British imperialists using muskets to steal land and modern family courts using state police to extract a man's wealth today.
Yeah, the structural comparison he makes there is very rigid.
Break that down because it's a huge jump.
Well, he argues that the 17th century landlords used colonial law to transfer Irish male wealth to a loyalist ruling class. Today, he claims, family court judges use the threat of state violence, meaning police enforcement, to transfer a father's wealth to a hostile ex-wife via no-fault divorce and alimony.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate for a second here, because connecting 17th century musket warfare directly to a modern divorce court is a completely orthogonal leap, right?
It is a massive leap.
We're talking about literal starvation versus modern legal proceedings. How does he actually bridge that gap?
So he paints this picture of a modern Dublin plasterer, right? A guy working 60 hours a week to pay the mortgage. He comes home, the locks are changed, and there's a state-sanctioned restraining order on the door based on an uncorroborated accusation.
Wow.
In the eyes of the court, Riker says he's no longer a father or a protector. He's an ATM, legally bound to fund his own displacement.
But if the mechanism of resource extraction is ultimately the same armed force, How does Riker explain the public's acceptance of the modern version? Why aren't people rioting?
Riker's answer to that skepticism is that the public accepted it because the state executed what he calls the greatest bait and switch in Western civilization.
The bait and switch.
Right. The state didn't come in with bayonets this time. It came in with clipboards and welfare checks. It offered security in exchange for sovereignty.
But the violence is still there.
According to him, yes. If you don't pay your court-ordered alimony, men with guns will eventually put you in a cage. But it is masked behind a facade of compassion and bureaucratic process.
So if the biological father is legally removed from the home, the biological requirements of raising children don't just magically disappear.
No, you still need resources, shelter, and protection.
Something has to fill the vacuum. Which brings us to Riker's analysis of the modern welfare state. He argues the state stepped in as the ultimate beta provider.
Yes, the ultimate beta provider. And he relies heavily on evolutionary psychology to explain how the bureaucratic state filled this void.
Let's define the core concept he uses here: hypergamy.
Sure. In evolutionary psychology, hypergamy is the drive to seek a mate of equal or higher socioeconomic status. It's the evolutionary imperative for women to secure the most capable protector and provider for their offspring.
Right, so in the ancestral environment, women relied on individual men for resource extraction and physical protection.
Exactly. But Riker argues that today, the government has hijacked that biological drive. He says the state functions as a hypergamous entity.
He calls it a sugar daddy equipped with an IRS database and a SWAT team.
That is a very vivid way to phrase it, yes.
It is.
The mechanism works like this. The government takes resources from productive men via taxation and uses those resources to fund single motherhood and state dependence.
By doing this, the state essentially offers women a financial contract to divorce their husbands and, quote, marry the bureaucracy.
Right, the state becomes a provider that never loses its job, never gets sick, and has infinite resources backed by the central bank.
And he points to very specific legislation to back up how this transition occurred. He calls them legislative torpedoes.
Legislative torpedoes, yeah. The initial breach he identifies goes back to 1839 with the Custody of Infants Act in England, which was spearheaded by a woman named Caroline Norton.
Why does 1839 matter so much to his timeline?
To understand why this matters, we have to look at the common law before 1839. It operated on the presumption of paternal right.
Meaning the father always got the kids?
Yes, because the father was the legally responsible provider who bore the absolute financial liability for his household. He retained custody of the children in the event of a separation. Liability and authority were linked.
So if you pay for them, you have authority over them.
Exactly. The 1839 Act began to sever that link, allowing mothers to petition for custody while the father remained financially liable. Riker sees this as the thin edge of the wedge.
Then he jumps to modern Ireland to pinpoint the final blow, highlighting the introduction of the one-parent family payment in 1997.
Yes, 1997.
Riker claims this wasn't just a safety net. He calls it a perverse financial incentive structure that fundamentally altered domestic dynamics.
The mechanism of that 1997 policy, according to Riker's framework, was to artificially make the biological father economically redundant.
Redundant how?
Well, if the state guarantees a continuous stream of revenue, housing, and medical care to unmarried or separated mothers, the father's primary evolutionary leverage, his ability to provide, is neutralized.
When the government writes the check, the government makes the rules.
Exactly. The traditional family unit is dismantled because the state is actively subsidizing its destruction.
And he brings in data on the modern Irish housing market to illustrate the real-world economic consequences of this.
Yeah, he talks about housing assistance payments, or HAP.
This is a crucial economic pillar of his argument. Because he doesn't just say the market got expensive, right? He explains the mechanics of how subsidized demand outpaces labor-based supply.
Right. Riker asserts that the state introduced massive welfare subsidies that artificially inflated the rental and property markets.
So normally, housing prices are constrained by the actual wages earned by local labor.
But with HAP, the government guaranteed landlords exorbitant sums of taxpayer money to house state dependents, completely regardless of the local wage economy.
So imagine a young man working hard in a trade, saving his money, trying to follow the traditional patriarchal script of buying a home and providing for a family.
Right.
He goes to rent or buy a modest house and he gets completely priced out. But he's not outbid by a guy who works 50 hours a week while he only works 40.
Now, according to Riker, he is outbid by his own confiscated tax euros.
That is wild.
The young man's labor is taxed by the state, And that money is pooled and used to subsidize the housing of a demographic that directly displaces him in the market.
And Riker views this not as an unfortunate economic byproduct, but as a deliberate engineered feature of what he calls female-coded leftism.
The state confiscates the productive energy of men and redirects it to sustain a system that disenfranchises them.
To hammer home the ethics of this, Riker actually pulls in Enlightenment philosophy, which I thought was a really interesting turn.
Yeah, he uses Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative.
For anyone who needs a quick refresher, the categorical imperative essentially demands that you only act according to rules that could be universally applied to all of society without causing a contradiction.
A simple example, if everyone felt entitled to steal when they were hungry, the concept of property would vanish and society would collapse. Therefore, stealing is universally unethical.
Right. And Riker extrapolates Kant's imperative directly to family court and taxation.
He does. He states that if individual men treated women the exact way the state and family courts treat men, meaning if men extracted resources under threat of violence, arbitrarily limited access to children, and enforced compliance through police power, society would instantly collapse into violent tribalism.
Therefore, he concludes, the feminist state-sponsored framework is entirely irrational and unethical when held to the standard of universal application.
That's his philosophical baseline, yeah.
I have to challenge the logical endpoint of this argument, though. Riker argues that marriage today is an asymmetrical trap where men assume all liability and no authority.
Right.
And he says the state is fully replacing the father. But if the state is already powerful enough to seize assets, mandate child support, and act as this ultimate provider, why keep up the illusion of the family court system at all?
That's a very fair question.
Why use family court as a middleman? Why doesn't the state just claim total direct authority over children and property from birth?
The author addresses this indirectly when he discusses what we could call the transference gap.
The transference gap. Okay.
To pull off a massive, continuous transfer of wealth from male producers to female consumers and state bureaucrats without sparking an outright violent revolution, the state requires a psychological buffer.
A buffer.
Right. If the government enacted direct, total tyranny, like just seizing assets without a hearing, men would rebel, just as the Irish rebelled against the British in 1916.
It makes me think of corporate embezzlement.
How so?
If an accountant wants to steal $1 million from a company, they don't walk into the vault and take briefcases of cash, right? The shareholders would notice immediately and call the police.
Right.
Instead, they skim fractions of a cent off every transaction over 2 decades. By the time the shareholders realize they are bankrupt, the money is gone and the accountant has already retired. Riker is basically arguing the family court system is the skimming mechanism.
That is a highly accurate analogy for his argument. By masking this massive wealth transfer in the bureaucratic language of fairness, or the best interests of the child, and progressive family law, the state pacifies the male population.
They make the extraction feel like a mundane legal process rather than an act of subjugation.
Exactly. But to maintain this illusion over decades, the state needed more than just courts. They needed complete control over the culture to write the cover story.
Which brings us to the epistemological warfare waged by the media and academia. This is where the book dives super deep into philosophy.
It really does. Riker argues there is a fundamental war at the root of Western civilization between masculine logos and feminine pathos.
He defines logos as objective truth, reason, and empiricism, right?
Yes. He associates this with Aristotle, with Newtonian physics, with the Roman codes of governance. It is the masculine pursuit of an objective reality that exists entirely independent of our personal feelings about it.
2 + 2 = 4, regardless of how that makes you feel.
Exactly. Pathos, on the other hand, he defines as emotional consensus and subjective reality, where feelings and group cohesion dictate what is considered true.
And he uses an incredible historical example to illustrate what happens when pathos becomes the dominant operating system of a society. The Salem witch trials of 1692.
Yeah, he calls it a terrifyingly flawless logical loop.
A logical loop. Break that down.
In colonial Massachusetts, if a woman confessed to being a witch, she was hanged. If she denied being a witch, her denial was taken as definitive proof of her guilt, because the community consensus was that only a guilty person would be so defensive.
Wow. Evidence, in the empirical sense of logos, ceased to matter entirely.
The subjective fear and emotional hysteria of the community became the only required proof.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. evidence doesn't matter, accusation is literally all that matters. And Riker argues this is the exact operating system of the modern gynocentric left.
He claims that modern feminism demands we legislate based on subjective feelings rather than objective facts.
Right.
The logic is that if someone feels violated, then a violation objectively occurred, regardless of physical evidence. He calls this epistemological totalitarianism.
Epistemological totalitarianism.
He argues that today's feminist state doesn't need empirical evidence to strip a man of his reputation or his children. It just needs an accusation, because the baseline assumption of pathos is that male authority is inherently oppressive and simply cannot be trusted.
So where does he say this modern ideological shift originated? Because it didn't just pop out of nowhere in the 1990s, you know?
No, not at all. He points directly to the Frankfurt School.
The Frankfurt School.
Yes, and he spends considerable time unpacking the mechanics of this philosophical pivot. In 1923, Felix Weil funded the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University, which became known as the Frankfurt School.
Okay.
Riker's analysis traces how classical Marxism relied on economic struggle, the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie. But by the mid-20th century, orthodox Marxism was failing in the West.
Why was it failing?
The working class had largely rejected violent revolution because, frankly, they liked the material rewards of capitalism. The rising tide was lifting their boats.
So the Marxist intellectuals had to pivot. If they couldn't start an economic revolution by pitting the worker against the capitalist boss, they would start a cultural and psychological one.
Right. Riker calls this the gynocentric silence doctrine.
The gynocentric silence doctrine.
Exactly. The mechanism of this pivot was substituting class warfare with gender warfare. They realized that the bedrock of capitalist stability was the traditional biological family unit.
So if they could destroy the family unit by weaponizing female hypergamy and encouraging state dependency, they could dismantle the capitalist structure from the inside out and expand state control indefinitely.
This argument, yes.
And their primary weapon in the psychological war, according to Riker, is language, specifically the phrase toxic masculinity.
Oh, he devotes a significant amount of time to deconstructing this specific phrase.
I bet.
He views it as a manufactured linguistic weapon designed to pathologize the very biology that built civilization. The left, he argues, wants to achieve male disarmament.
Disarmament.
Right, so they take normal biological marital behaviors, stoicism, competitiveness, the drive for hierarchy, the instinct for physical protection, and they frame them as inherently predatory or socially dangerous.
He draws a stark contrast here to highlight what he sees as the staggering hypocrisy of this worldview, and he pulls a statistic that really caught my eye.
Which one?
92% of all occupational deaths are men. Miners, roofers, loggers, ironworkers getting crushed, electrocuted, and incinerated every single day just to keep the power grid running and the supply chains moving.
Yeah, the imagery he uses is very deliberate.
Right, and he contrasts this bleeding, freezing man fixing a high-voltage line to keep his family alive with a state-employed academic.
He describes the modern sociologist sitting in a climate-controlled building, a building engineered and built entirely by male labor, typing on a microprocessor invented by men, protected by a male-dominated military.
Writing a taxpayer-funded thesis about male uselessness and toxicity.
Yes.
Yes.
Riker calls this a spectacular, narcissistic inversion of reality. He views the academic as a parasite biting the hand that feeds it, entirely oblivious to the fact that her entire worldview is completely subsidized by male competence and physical sacrifice.
He argues that academia treats the ultimate surplus value, men sacrificing their bodies in coal mines or on the beaches of Normandy, as oppression, which he claims is just psychological warfare to mask the parasitism of the welfare state.
That is the core of his critique of academia, yeah.
But it's not just academics writing dense papers that no one reads, right? Riker points out that this programming is piped directly into our living rooms. Let's look at his observation about television, what he calls the patriarchal inversion tactic.
This is actually one of his most successful points. He analyzes the media landscape of the 1990s and 2000s, and he asks the reader to look at the sitcom dads consumed by millions of people globally.
We're talking Homer Simpson, Ray Barone from Everybody Loves Raymond, Peter Griffin from Family Guy, Tim Taylor from Home Improvement.
Exactly. They are almost universally portrayed via a specific archetype, morally deficient, slightly overweight, incompetent oafs who can barely operate a dishwasher.
Right.
And they're constantly having to be rescued, corrected, or scolded by their hyper-competent, long-suffering wives.
Now, I do have to push back a little on this.
Go ahead.
Is this really a coordinated psychological operation, or is it just, lazy comedy? The bumbling dad is an easy trope. Writers are on a deadline, they need laughs, and making the big guy look foolish is a classic comedic setup. Isn't he reading way too much into an episode of The Simpsons?
Riker anticipates that exact defense.
Oh, he does.
He does. His counterargument is that culture is downstream of philosophy. Whether the individual sitcom writers were consciously executing a Marxist agenda or just chasing cheap laughs is irrelevant to the final outcome.
The result is the same.
Right. The result is a coordinated, multi-decade cultural scripting. The mechanism of this psychological operation is the erosion of male confidence in the domestic sphere.
So if you broadcast 1 million hours of television telling women that male authority is a laughable, dangerous joke, and telling women that they are the only competent adults in the room, it shifts the cultural baseline.
And if the cultural baseline is that fathers are domestic idiots who can't be trusted to watch their own kids without burning the house down.
It makes it incredibly easy for the state to step in and usurp the male role in the home.
Precisely. Riker argues that he who is mocked is he who is stripped of authority. You cannot build a civilization of strong leaders if your cultural script is designed to endlessly humiliate them in front of their own children.
But if the culture has already stripped the father of his psychological authority, what happens to his actual biology? This is where Riker argues the psychological attack becomes a physical one, right?
Yes.
He believes there is an actual biological eradication of men occurring simultaneously.
This moves us into the biological and social suppression of male vitality. He argues that the state doesn't just want men culturally mocked, it needs them physically weak.
Why physically weak?
Because a feminized, low-testosterone man is a compliant citizen who lacks the aggression to ever rebel.
He pulls in some heavy scientific data here. Let's unpack Dr. Shanna Swan's research.
Dr. Shanna Swan's 2017 meta-analysis on plummeting sperm counts across the Western world is a huge anchor for his biological argument.
The numbers are staggering.
They are. Swan's research indicated that sperm counts in men from North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand dropped by over 50% in less than 40 years.
Over 50%.
And Riker pairs this with a 2007 Endocrine Society study tracking a systemic, alarming, and population-wide decline in male testosterone levels over recent decades. These aren't fringe studies. They are mainstream biological data points.
And Riker asks a very pertinent question here. If a biological marker of human reproduction drops by 50% in 4 decades, why isn't the scientific community sounding the alarm from the rooftops?
Right.
Why isn't this a daily national emergency?
His answer is that the gynocentric matrix imposed a conspiracy of silence because this biological decline actively serves their political goals. He argues that the state engineers this collapse of masculine virtue through systemic overconsumption, the saturation of endocrine-disrupting chemical pollutants in our food and water, and the pacification of the male brain through cheap digital dopamine.
You mean like pornography, video games, infinite scrolling?
Exactly. It is a biological warfare campaign. He points out the irony that the culture tells you masculinity is merely a social construct while they actively medicate your actual biology out of existence.
To really drive this home, he brings in historical contrast to show what high testosterone masculinity actually looks like when confronted with tyranny.
He goes back to Ireland for this.
Yes, to the 1916 Easter Rising. I want to paint the picture of this because it's vital to his point. April 24th, 1916. Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, and the Military Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood marching right into the General Post Office in Dublin to declare an independent republic.
And Riker highlights that these men were not professional soldiers with administrative logistics behind them. They were poets, union workers, school teachers, and revolutionaries.
They didn't ask the British Empire for a seat at the table.
No, they didn't hold a permitted protest, and they definitely didn't ask for a safe space. They had an absolute surplus of biological drive and a mandate to protect their kin and their nation.
And Riker argues that men of that iron purpose, who possess the masculine virtue to embrace certain death for a higher principle, are exactly what the modern state is terrified of.
He claims that modern society intentionally breeds men who would be absolutely slaughtered in a scenario like 1916. Men who have been systematically stripped of their warrior essence.
He even points to the Irish Constitution itself to show how far the legal framework has fallen, right? He references Article 41.2, which was drafted in 1937.
Article 41.2 explicitly recognized the dignity of the family unit and acknowledged that a woman's life within the home provided a vital support to the state without which the common good could not be achieved.
It essentially acknowledged a natural biological division of labor.
Exactly. Implicitly recognizing the man as the external provider and protector. Today, Riker says, modern progressive movements view this article as an embarrassing anachronism to be deleted, which to him is further proof that the state wishes to pathologize the traditional male provider role entirely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he links this biological suppression directly to the deliberate destruction of male-only spaces.
This is a foundational premise for her.
He looks at history and makes the claim that all ancient surviving civilizations relied on exclusive male brotherhoods to forge warriors and maintain social order.
Throughout history, men organized themselves into exclusive fraternities, brotherhoods, and lodges. The mechanism of these groups was essential for parallel governance.
Give us some examples of that.
Well, Riker points to historical Irish secret societies like the White Boys, the Defenders, or the Ribbon Men. After the British stripped Catholic Irishmen of their legal rights and property, these male-only societies stepped in.
What did they do?
They enforced local justice, protected vulnerable tenant farmers from eviction, and maintained a fierce masculine identity under absolute oppression. The British Empire called them terrorists and extremists. Local history calls them freedom fighters.
And he says the modern state views male brotherhoods as a threat for the exact same reason a tight-knit group of capable men threatens the state's monopoly on violence and loyalty.
Exactly. Moving into the 20th century, he references the decline of fraternal organizations in the West. The Elks Lodge, the Moose Lodge, the Knights of Columbus, the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Before the modern welfare state, these spaces weren't just, drinking clubs, right?
Not at all. They provided critical structure, purpose, mentorship for young men, and mutual aid. If a member died, the lodge took care of the widow.
So Riker argues these spaces didn't just die out naturally because men lost interest, they were intentionally killed.
By two specific targeted forces. First, he blames the ideological imperative of second-wave feminism, which aggressively demanded female entry into all historically male spaces via lawsuits and cultural shaming.
Right. And second, the expansion of the welfare state itself.
Right. When the government began offering welfare checks, life insurance, and state-funded pensions, the mutual aid aspect of these fraternal societies was rendered completely redundant.
The cold, bureaucratic government check substituted the warm hand of the brother.
That's exactly how he puts it.
He also heavily blames Hollywood and the media apparatus for pathologizing these spaces. He uses the 1999 movie Fight Club as a prime example of cultural framing.
Fight Club is a brilliant analytical lens for Riker. He argues that the original narrative of Fight Club was actually a subversive, deeply pro-masculine diagnosis of the spiritual starvation of the modern consumerist man.
But look at how the cultural apparatus processed it.
The media machine systematically reduced its message, framing it as a dangerous manifesto of toxic masculinity and incel ideology.
Riker argues the media intentionally frames men bonding outside of female supervision in one of two ways.
Right. Either it's psychotic domestic terrorism, like they claim Fight Club is, or it's pathetic juvenile buffoonery, like Homer Simpson at his bowling league.
There is no cultural space allowed for serious, dignified male bonding.
Not at all.
So I have to ask you, the listener, to ponder this question based on Riker's evidence. If all ancient surviving civilizations relied on exclusive male brotherhoods to forge warriors and delay gratification for the greater good, what happens to a civilization that treats the delay of gratification as a pathology and literally outlaws the male tribe?
Riker's answer to that is mathematically blunting. It collapses.
It just collapses.
Yeah.
With all these historical, cultural, and biological traps laid out, with the mechanisms of the humiliation architecture fully exposed, how does a man break free? Because Riker doesn't just leave the reader in a state of despair, right? He offers a solution.
He does. He pivots to an actionable blueprint for what he calls the rational patriarch, which is outlined in a manifesto he calls Praxa, the Iron Shamrock.
The Iron Shamrock.
And the very first thing he establishes is a harsh reality check. He states very clearly that attempting to vote, tweet, or debate your way out of this systemic collapse is a mathematical fallacy.
He writes, "You do not vote to save a sinking ship, you build a lifeboat."
It is a very powerful framing.
It really is. The system is operating exactly as it was designed to, so trying to pull a lever in a voting booth every 4 years isn't going to dismantle an 800-year architecture. So what does this lifeboat actually look like?
The foundation of the lifeboat is the concept of the silent brotherhood and the absolute necessity of reclaiming what he calls the micro-kingdom of your own household.
Reclaiming the micro-kingdom.
To do this, Riker advises men to look past modern progressive law and apply Roman legal pragmatism. Specifically, He evokes the spirit of the Roman paterfamilias.
Okay, remind us what the paterfamilias was.
In ancient Rome, the paterfamilias was the oldest living male in a household, and he held absolute sovereign authority over his family, his property, and his dependents. But crucially, with that absolute authority came absolute liability for their welfare and economic output.
Practically speaking, though, how does a modern man channel the paterfamilias when, as Riker just spent hundreds of pages arguing, the family courts and the state are heavily stacked against him? Like, how do you assert sovereignty when the state has a SWAT team?
Right. Well, Riker advocates a highly disciplined strategy of starving the beast. He advises men to ruthlessly audit their financial lives, their careers, and their consumption habits to legally minimize their tax footprint. The logic is simple. If the gynocentric state uses male tax dollars to fund its own expansion and subsidize the destruction of the family unit, then the rational man must legally withhold as much of that capital as possible.
So he's talking about financial sovereignty, utilizing the tax code aggressively.
Yes. He suggests structuring assets, using legal entities, corporations, and irrevocable trusts to protect wealth from state confiscation and family court seizure.
The goal is to operate exactly like a Roman patrician, protecting his estate from a corrupt emperor.
You own nothing on paper, but you control everything through legal architecture.
But it's not just about money, is it? It's also about linguistic sovereignty. He talks extensively about refusing to adopt corporate jargon and the approved syntax of the left.
He argues that adopting the socially proved syntax of the left, using their buzzwords, apologizing for your biological nature, putting pronouns in a bio, is an act of intellectual submission to a tyrannical reality.
You become a willing participant in your own psychological colonization.
Exactly. He demands that men force these ideological opponents to define their terms using Aristotelian logic and empirical definitions.
When someone accuses you of toxic masculinity, do not apologize.
Demand a scientific, neurological definition of the term. Force them into the realm of logos. When they can't provide empirical evidence and fall back on emotional pathos, their illusion of moral superiority evaporates.
He highlights two incredibly powerful examples of masculine resistance from history to inspire this modern rebellion. The first is Bobby Sands.
The 1981 Irish hunger strike in the Maze prison. Riker frames this not just as a political protest by the IRA against the Thatcher government, but as the ultimate apotheosis of masculine stoicism and willpower.
Bobby Sands starved himself for 66 days until his body consumed itself, and he died.
Riker uses this horrific, profound event to prove a philosophical point. A man who completely masters his own physical suffering, who cannot be broken by pain or deprivation, becomes an unstoppable psychological force against an empire.
He contrasts this iron mastery of the self with the modern feminized male who suffers a panic attack if his Wi-Fi drops, or if he has to fast for 3 hours.
Yeah, mastery over the self is the only way to master the environment.
And the second historical example goes back even further, to the 6th century, St. Finian and the monastic tradition.
Right. When the Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of its own decadence, inflation, and overexpansion, the strong men of the era didn't weep, and they didn't ask the crumbling bureaucracy for permission to survive.
They retreated.
St. Finian founded the monastery of Clonard in Ireland. These monastic men preserved the knowledge of antiquity, Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, agricultural science, while the rest of the continent burned and descended into the Dark Ages.
They built a parallel civilization based on rigorous, unforgiving discipline.
Riker says modern men must do the exact same thing by forming the silent brotherhood clandestine fraternal orders of iron, commerce, and mutual defense, preserving the fire of Western civilization while the modern welfare state collapses under its own weight.
Retreating to preserve the fire, that is a heavy mandate. And for the listener who wants to start breaking their own programming right now, today, Riker offers an actionable, immediate challenge. He calls it the optic fast.
The optic fast, yes.
I want to challenge you, the listener, to try this. For 1 week, watch mainstream media, watch television, watch commercial, and every single time a male character is humiliated, portrayed as a bumbling idiot, or saved by a hyper-competent woman, loudly vocalize it.
Point at the screen and say, patriarchal inversion tactic.
Riker says that breaking the spell requires consciously recognizing the programming. When you name the subversion out loud, you drag it from the subconscious into the conscious mind, and the matrix loses its grip on you.
It is a profound exercise in epistemological self-defense.
It really is.
Riker's final call to arms is for men to completely stop apologizing for the strength aggression, and stoicism their ancestors fought and died to give them.
He notes a critical historical reality, right? Throughout history, you do not need a majority to shift a culture or survive a collapse.
No, you only need an uncompromising, highly organized 3% vanguard. The female-coded matrix relies entirely on the passive compliance of the 97%. Riker says we only need the iron resolve of the 3% to build the lifeboats.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. From the 1704 penal laws and the economic suppression of the 5-pound horse, to the coffin ships of the famine, to the 1997 welfare policies that subsidize single motherhood.
It's a lot to take in.
We've traced the philosophical war between objective logos and emotional pathos via the Frankfurt School, looked at the plummeting biological markers of masculinity in modern men, and mapped out a Roman-inspired blueprint for taking back the micro-kingdom of the home.
It is a massive unified theory of masculine decline and restoration. And to leave you with a final provocative thought, to mull over one that builds on everything Riker has argued but looks strictly to the future.
Yeah, what's that?
If the patriarchal structures that build Western civilization are fully dismantled, and the state completely monopolizes the roles of protector and provider using extracted tax dollars, what happens to the state itself when it inevitably runs out of the raw male productive labor required to fund it?
Right.
If the birth rates collapse and men starve the beast by opting out of hypertaxation, the system mathematically consumes itself. When it goes bankrupt, does it simply collapse, leaving a vacuum for a more primal, unapologetic patriarchal culture from outside the West to step into and conquer?
That is a chilling question, and it perfectly encapsulates the stakes of this deep dive. Listen, if this discussion gave you the intellectual ammunition you've been searching for, if you feel like you finally have a framework to understand what is happening to modern institutions before they were captured, you must read the full text.
Highly recommend it.
Check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Colonized by Cowards, How the State Replaced the Irish Father and Destroyed the Home by Conrad Riker. And once you read it, leave a 5-star review. Defeating the algorithm helps other men find this critical framework.
The author makes it very clear that those reviews are acts of defiance against a digital system designed to suppress this exact message.
Absolutely. Also, make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for continued analysis on masculine restoration, history, and philosophy. Finally, please like and subscribe to this show so you never miss another deep dive. Thank you for joining us in the trenches today. Until next time.